September 17th, 1944, 8:45 in the evening. The northern end of a 2,000-foot bridge spanning the Rhine at Arnhem. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost crouched behind a shattered window frame, watching German infantry probe his positions through the gathering darkness. Behind him, 745 lightly armed paratroopers occupied 18 houses clustered around the bridge's approach ramp. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They were supposed to hold for 48 hours, long enough for 30,000 British tanks to cover the 60 miles from the Belgian border. But the radio, sitting dead in the corner of Frost's headquarters, told a different story. No contact with division, no contact with the ground forces driving north, just the static hiss of equipment that had been failing since the moment they landed, and the Germans gathering in the streets beyond his perimeter, not the demoralized rear area troops that intelligence had promised. SS Panzer divisions, veterans from Normandy, men who understood exactly what holding this bridge meant and what they would do to take it back. The plan had seemed so elegant on paper. Operation Market Garden, 3 airborne divisions dropping like a carpet across Holland, seizing 9 bridges in a single afternoon, 30 corps racing up a single highway to link them all together. A dagger thrust 62 miles into German-occupied territory that would bypass the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and open the road to Berlin itself. The war could be over by Christmas. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had sold it as the bold stroke that would win the war. 35,000 paratroopers would land at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, creating an airborne corridor for the tanks to follow. The American 101st Airborne would take the southern bridges. The American 82nd would secure Nijmegen in the centre, and Britain's 1st Airborne Division, the proud veterans who had jumped into North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, would capture the prize itself, the bridge at Arnhem, the last crossing point over the Rhine before Germany's industrial heartland lay exposed. 48 hours. That was the estimate. 2 days to hold one bridge, while the fastest armoured column in military history covered 60 miles of Dutch countryside. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne, had listened to the briefing with growing unease. His signals officers warned that the radios wouldn't work in Arnhem's wooded terrain. His intelligence section reported SS Panzer divisions refitting just north of the city. The drop zones were 8 miles from the bridge itself, forcing his men to march through hostile territory with nothing heavier than what they could carry. But the plan had already been approved at the highest levels. Eisenhower himself had blessed Montgomery's vision. The 1st Allied Airborne Army, formed just weeks earlier, needed a mission worthy of its existence, and the momentum from Normandy couldn't be allowed to falter now that German forces were reeling back toward their own borders. So on the morning of September 17th, 1944, the largest airborne operation in history lifted off from English airfields, Douglas C-47s and converted bombers towing gliders, thousands of aircraft forming columns that stretched for miles, men of 3 nations preparing to drop into a foreign country they'd been told would welcome them as liberators. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost commanded the 2nd Battalion of the British Parachute Regiment. His men were elite soldiers, volunteers who had passed through selection processes designed to break average infantrymen. They had trained for years in the brutal skills of airborne warfare, how to exit an aircraft moving at 120 miles per hour, how to assemble a scattered force in darkness, how to fight with limited ammunition against superior numbers while waiting for relief that might never come. Frost himself was already a legend in airborne circles. In February 1942, he had led Operation Biting, a raid on a German radar installation at Bruneval on the French coast. 120 men had parachuted onto a cliff top, dismantled components of the advanced Würzburg radar, and fought their way to an evacuation beach under fire. The mission had been a complete success, delivering crucial intelligence about German air defense capabilities. Now, 30 months later, Frost was leading 745 men on a mission that military doctrine said was impossible. The planners had given his battalion the southern route into Arnhem, following the Rhine's northern bank. They were to capture the main road bridge, the railway bridge to the west, and a pontoon bridge between them. Then, hold all three crossings until the full division of 10,000 men assembled around them. The reality began to unravel within minutes of landing. Frost had brought a hunting horn to speed assembly on the drop zone, and its clear notes cut through the afternoon air as paratroopers gathered their equipment. But the march into Arnhem revealed problems the briefings had never mentioned. The railway bridge exploded before his eyes, demolished by German engineers who had no intention of leaving their infrastructure intact. The pontoon bridge was missing its central sections, useless for any crossing attempt. That left one objective: the road bridge at Arnhem, 2,000 feet of steel spanning the Rhine, vital not just for this operation, but for any German forces trying to withdraw from Holland, or any Allied forces trying to advance into Germany. Whoever controlled that bridge controlled the entire region's strategic mobility. Frost's battalion moved through Arnhem as evening fell, experiencing the surreal disconnect between military reality and civilian expectation. Dutch citizens lined the streets, cheering the paratroopers, pressing cups of water into their hands, celebrating liberation that had not yet been secured. The march slowed to a crawl as grateful civilians blocked the roads, while German snipers and scattered defensive positions forced the battalion into repeated small firefights. But they reached the bridge. At 8 o'clock in the evening of September 17th, Lieutenant Jack Grayburn's platoon arrived at the northern ramp and immediately took up positions in the buildings, clustering around the approach. Other elements of the battalion flowed in behind them. Brigade headquarters arrived, adding another 110 men, a troop of Royal Engineers, a platoon of anti-tank guns, various other support units that had followed Frost's route rather than attempting to fight through to their own objectives. In all, roughly 750 men occupied positions around the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. If the plan had worked, there would have been 9,000. An entire airborne division holding both ends of the crossing, with tanks arriving within 48 hours. Instead, Frost commanded less than one battalion, isolated 8 miles from the rest of his division, with no working communications and no clear idea when or if relief would arrive. But they held the northern end, and German forces, surprised by the speed of the British advance, had made a critical error. SS Hauptsturmführer Victor Gräbner's reconnaissance battalion had crossed the bridge just hours before Frost arrived, heading south to investigate Allied landings at Nijmegen. They had left the bridge virtually unguarded. 20 elderly Volkssturm conscripts in a pillbox at the bridge's centre, a few flak guns that could be turned against ground targets. Nothing capable of stopping determined paratroopers who understood exactly how valuable their objective was. Lieutenant Grayburn led an assault across the bridge itself, attempting to capture the southern end and give the British control of both approaches. His platoon advanced into a killing zone illuminated by German flares, where machine gun fire turned the bridge's steel structure into a cage of ricocheting bullets. The tracer rounds painted green and red arcs through the darkness, while Grayburn's men crawled forward over exposed roadway with no cover except the bridge's low railings. They couldn't reach the southern end. German positions on the far bank had clear fields of fire across the entire span. Every man who tried to cross became a target for weapons firing from prepared positions. Grayburn pulled his survivors back after taking a bullet through the shoulder, establishing the tactical reality that would define the next 4 days. The British held the northern end, the Germans held the southern end, and the 2,000-foot bridge between them was a no-man's land that neither side could cross. Frost established his headquarters in a building overlooking the bridge's northern ramp. His second-in-command, Major David Wallace, organised the perimeter defence. Captain Tony Frank's engineers prepared demolition charges in case the bridge had to be destroyed rather than surrendered. And the 750 British paratroopers settled into positions they'd been told to hold for 48 hours. The first night passed in relative quiet. German forces were still reacting to the scale of the airborne assault, trying to understand where Allied forces had landed and in what strength. Model, the German Field Marshal commanding Army Group B, had initially thought the paratroopers were coming specifically to capture him. He'd fled his headquarters at the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, leaving behind coffee still warm in his cup, and relocated to a safer command post east of Arnhem. But by dawn on September 18th, German tactical response was beginning to take shape. SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, consisting of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. Both divisions had been mauled in Normandy. Both had barely escaped the Falaise pocket. Both were in Arnhem specifically because they needed time to rest, refit, and absorb replacements before returning to combat strength. The 9th SS had approximately 6,000 men. The 10th SS had similar numbers. Between them, they could field perhaps 30 operational tanks, mostly Panthers and late-model Panzer IVs, with their heavier armour loaded onto trains for transport to repair depots in Germany. They were a shadow of full divisional strength. But they were veterans, men who had fought British and American forces for 3 months in Normandy, men who understood armoured warfare, combined arms tactics, and the brutal mathematics of urban combat, and they were already in position. The 9th SS would defend Arnhem itself. The 10th SS would move south to block the American advance at Nijmegen, and Frost's 750 paratroopers would face an enemy force that grew stronger with every passing hour. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The second day brought German probes against the perimeter. Not the overwhelming assault that Frost expected, but careful reconnaissance in force operations designed to identify British positions and test their defensive firepower. SS infantry would advance to within grenade range, force the paratroopers to reveal their positions with return fire, then withdraw and report what they'd learned to their commanders. It was methodical, professional. Exactly the kind of tactics that veterans employed when facing an unknown enemy in urban terrain. The Germans were learning the British defensive layout one building at a time, mapping fields of fire, identifying weapons positions, locating the British headquarters building where Frost coordinated his defence. And then Victor Gräbner's reconnaissance battalion returned from Nijmegen, 40 armoured cars and half-tracks racing north on the assumption that the bridge was still in German hands. The battalion had been ordered south the previous day to investigate the American landings. Now, convinced that Nijmegen was secure and that their services were needed elsewhere, they were coming back across the bridge they thought was theirs. Frost's men watched them approach, armoured vehicles moving at speed through the evening twilight, clearly expecting to cross unopposed. The paratroopers held their fire until the lead vehicles were committed to the bridge. Then every weapon that could bear on the target opened fire simultaneously. 6-pounder anti-tank guns, firing armour-piercing rounds at point-blank range. PAAT anti-tank rockets streaking across the 100 yards between buildings and bridge. Small arms fire concentrating on the exposed infantry riding on top of the vehicles. And the Germans, caught in the open on a narrow span with nowhere to manoeuvre, began to die. The reconnaissance battalion was annihilated. 12 vehicles destroyed, Gräbner himself killed in the opening volley. His men fought with desperate courage, trying to reverse direction on a bridge clogged with burning wreckage, trying to suppress the British fire with their own mounted weapons, trying simply to survive long enough to escape back to the southern end. A few vehicles made it through. Most did not. By the time darkness fell again, the bridge was a charnel house of destroyed armour and German dead, and Frost's paratroopers had won a tactical victory that proved they could hold against determined assault. But the cost was terrible. They had expended vast quantities of ammunition, hundreds of rounds for every weapon in the defensive perimeter. The stockpiles they'd carefully rationed through the first day were now depleted to levels that couldn't sustain another engagement of similar intensity, and resupply was impossible. The radios didn't work. The rest of the division was pinned down west of Arnhem, and the relief column from the south hadn't even reached Nijmegen yet. Frost gathered his officers that evening in the brigade headquarters building. The tactical situation was clear. They held the bridge. The Germans knew they held the bridge, and the Germans would return with overwhelming force to take it back. The only questions were when and with what. Major Hibbert, commanding the brigade headquarters detachment, had been in contact with 1st Battalion via the public telephone system. The civilian network, bizarrely, still functioned even as military radios failed completely. Through those improvised communications, Frost learned that Brigadier Lathbury was missing. that 1st and 3rd Battalions were pinned down near Street, Elizabeth Hospital, that the rest of the division was fighting desperately just to survive west of the city. No relief was coming from that direction. Not tomorrow. Possibly not ever. Frost formally assumed command of all forces at the bridge. 750 men, 18 buildings, 1 bridge, and the growing certainty that they were completely alone. The 3rd day brought the full weight of German tactical response. Artillery began systematically destroying the buildings where British paratroopers had taken shelter. Not random harassment fire, but carefully plotted concentrations designed to collapse structures on their defenders. SS infantry advanced under cover of the bombardment, using assault tactics refined over years of urban combat, flamethrowers to clear ground floors, grenades through windows to suppress upper stories, close-range machine gun fire to catch anyone trying to evacuate. The British positions began to burn. Buildings that had provided shelter became death traps as German artillery set roofs ablaze. Wounded men had to be dragged from collapsing structures while under fire. The 2 medical officers, Captains Logan and Wright, treated casualties in basements that shook with each artillery impact, working without surgical equipment, without adequate supplies, without any hope of evacuating the seriously wounded to proper medical facilities. Radio contact with division headquarters flickered briefly, then died again. During one moment of clear transmission, Frost heard that the rest of 1st Airborne was consolidating around the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. They were forming a defensive perimeter, 7 miles west of the bridge. They could not break through to relieve him. And 30 Corps, the armoured column that was supposed to arrive in 48 hours, was still fighting at Nijmegen. Ammunition became critical, not the careful rationing of supplies to last until relief arrived, but the immediate crisis of running out during active combat. The 6-pounder anti-tank guns that had destroyed Grabner's battalion now had fewer than 20 rounds between them. Small arms ammunition was being redistributed from the dead to the living. The Piat launchers had expended most of their rockets during the bridge fight, and the Germans kept coming. SS Panzer Grenadiers supported by self-propelled guns, assault groups with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Infantry advancing under cover of tanks that fired high-explosive rounds directly into British defensive positions at ranges measured in tens of meters. The perimeter contracted. Buildings on the eastern flank fell to German assault. The Van Limburg-Stierum School, held by Royal Engineers and men from 3rd Battalion, collapsed under sustained shelling after its defenders ran out of ammunition. The Germans were methodically eliminating British strongpoints, reducing the defensive perimeter 1 position at a time through overwhelming firepower and professional small unit tactics. Frost was wounded on the 3rd day. Shrapnel from a German shell caught him in both feet as he moved between positions. The injury wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it reduced his mobility at exactly the moment when personal leadership mattered most. He continued commanding from the brigade headquarters building, directing fire, coordinating what little resupply was possible between positions, and maintaining the morale of men who understood they were fighting a losing battle. Water became scarce. The building's plumbing had been damaged by shelling. What water remained in pipes was contaminated or inaccessible. Men licked condensation from walls. They collected rainwater in helmets. They went without for hours at a time while fighting continued. Food was nearly gone. The paratroopers had jumped with minimal rations, expecting resupply within 24 hours. Now, on the 3rd day, men were sharing single biscuits between 3 soldiers. Some hadn't eaten in 2 days. Physical exhaustion combined with malnutrition to create a state where soldiers fought on nothing but determination and training. And still, they held. Every German assault was beaten back. Every attempt to rush the remaining British positions was stopped by men who refused to surrender, even as their situation became hopeless. Lieutenant Greyburn, wounded 3 times now, continued fighting from a forward position near the bridge itself. Captain Mackay's engineers held the eastern approaches despite losing half their men. Major Wallace coordinated the shrinking defence with the calm professionalism of an officer who knew his duty regardless of the outcome. On the night of September 20th, with ammunition nearly exhausted and the perimeter reduced to a handful of buildings, Frost's men prepared for what they knew would be the final assault. German loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands in English. SS commanders, impressed by the British defence, offered to evacuate the wounded if Frost would surrender his remaining forces. He refused, not through false heroism or impossible optimism, but through the simple calculation that every hour the Germans spent fighting for this bridge was an hour they couldn't use to reinforce Nijmegen or attack the rest of 1st Airborne at Oosterbeek. The morning of September 21st arrived with the sound every defender dreaded. Tank engines. Not the distant rumble of armour repositioning, but the immediate roar of heavy vehicles moving into assault positions just beyond the perimeter. Kampfgruppe Knaust had arrived. Battalion-strength infantry, supported by Panther tanks and assault guns. Professional soldiers with the equipment and tactical training to reduce fortified positions through coordinated fire and manoeuvre. The British had fought SS infantry for 3 days. They had destroyed a reconnaissance battalion on the bridge itself. They had held buildings under artillery bombardment that would have broken most defensive positions within hours. But they had done it all with the weapons they'd carried in on the drop. 6-pounder anti-tank guns with fewer than a dozen rounds remaining. Piat launchers with perhaps 3 rockets total across the entire perimeter. Rifles and Sten guns firing the last magazines from dead men's pouches. Against Panthers. Against self-propelled guns firing from positions where British return fire couldn't reach them. Against an enemy that had learned, over 3 days of bloody fighting, exactly where every British defensive position was located and exactly how much firepower each could bring to bear. The assault began with German artillery firing directly into the buildings at ranges under 200 yards. High explosive rounds that didn't just damage structures but collapsed them entirely. Walls that had survived 3 days of shelling simply ceased to exist under this concentrated bombardment. Men were buried in rubble, wounded soldiers trapped in basements as upper floors pancaked down on top of them. SS infantry followed immediately behind the artillery, advancing under covering fire from tanks that were invulnerable to anything the British could still field. Flamethrowers cleared ground floors. Grenades detonated in every room. Machine gun fire raked windows where British defenders tried to return fire with weapons that were running out of ammunition. The brigade headquarters building, Frost's command post for 4 days, began to burn. Artillery had set the upper floors ablaze, and fire spread through the structure faster than the wounded could be evacuated. Major Lewis and Lieutenant Wright, officers who had held the Van Limburg Steerum School building, died when a shell burst where they had taken shelter. 200 wounded men occupied the building's basement, men who could not be moved under fire, men who would burn alive if the building collapsed. Frost, wounded and unable to walk, was carried from his headquarters as German infantry approached within grenade range. The defence was fragmenting, not breaking, because that implied loss of discipline or failure of courage, but fragmenting in the literal sense. Individual buildings fighting their own battles, small groups of paratroopers defending single rooms, officers losing contact with their men as the perimeter dissolved into isolated strong points. Captain Mackay's engineers, holding the eastern flank, were down to 30 unwounded men. They had fought from the same position for 4 days, beating back assault after assault with diminishing ammunition and no possibility of reinforcement. Now, with German tanks firing directly into their building and SS infantry surrounding them from 3 sides, they prepared for the final stand. It came at 1100 hours. A coordinated assault by Kampfgruppe Brinkmann against the buildings still holding out around the bridge's northern approach. Panthers firing high explosive rounds through walls at point-blank range. Infantry, following with grenades and automatic weapons, flamethrowers igniting everything that would burn. The British fought with everything they had left. Men threw their last grenades, fired their last magazines, used rifle butts and entrenching tools when ammunition ran out. But there was no longer any possibility of holding. The Germans had too much firepower, too many men, too much professional competence applied against a defensive position that had finally exceeded the limits of what courage and training could sustain. By noon, the Germans controlled the bridge. The bunker on the northern approach, held by British engineers through days of assault, fell to Kampfgruppe Brinkmann's final attack. The few British positions still holding out were isolated, cut off from each other, unable to coordinate defence or support adjacent positions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The last radio message from the bridge had gone out hours earlier, 5 words that captured everything about the defense and its inevitable end. Out of ammunition. God save the King. No dramatics, no false heroics, just the simple acknowledgement that men who had fought for 4 days against impossible odds had finally reached the point where fighting was no longer physically possible. Approximately 100 British paratroopers remained unwounded. 745 had reached the bridge on the evening of September 17th. Over 4 days of continuous combat, they had suffered roughly 80% casualties. 81 men killed, nearly 600 wounded. The rest so exhausted that they could barely stand. Frost himself was captured, his ankle wounds having opened up again during the evacuation from the headquarters building. He would spend the remainder of the war in German prisoner-of-war camps, first at WWII at Spangenberg, then at a POW hospital at Obermarsfeld. Liberation would come in March 1945 when American forces overran the area, but that was still 6 months away. The Germans who had fought to retake the bridge treated their prisoners with professional respect. SS officers, impressed by the British defence, provided medical care for the wounded and arranged 2-hour truces to evacuate casualties from burning buildings. One German NCO, slightly cross-eyed and wearing a civilian shirt under his tunic, greeted captured paratroopers with the words, "That was a lovely battle, a really lovely battle. Have a cigar. We are human too." It was the tribute that professional soldiers pay to worthy opponents, the recognition that men who had held impossible positions against overwhelming odds had earned something beyond simple defeat. The British paratroopers had turned what should have been a 1-day battle into a 4-day siege that fundamentally altered German tactical planning throughout the entire Market Garden operation. Because, while 750 men fought and died at Arnhem Bridge, the rest of 1st Airborne Division was fighting its own desperate battle at Oosterbeek. Major General Urquhart had consolidated his remaining forces into a defensive perimeter roughly 2 miles west of Arnhem, forming a horseshoe-shaped line along the Rhine with his headquarters at the Hartenstein Hotel. The tactical situation there was, if anything, worse than at the bridge. 10,000 men had dropped on September 17th. After 4 days of combat, Urquhart commanded fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. Radio communications had failed almost completely. The No. 18 wireless sets, with their effective range of 2 to 5 miles in urban terrain, couldn't reach either 30 Corps to the south or the RAF bases in England. Resupply drops landed in German-controlled territory, where captured ammunition and medical supplies were immediately turned against their intended recipients. German forces were tightening the noose. Kampfgruppe Tettau pressed from the west. The 9th SS Panzer Division attacked from the east. Artillery fire fell continuously on positions where men had no shelter except the ruins of buildings already destroyed by previous bombardments. Casualties mounted hourly. The wounded filled aid stations that had no supplies, no surgical teams, no possibility of evacuation. And 30 Corps, the armoured column that was supposed to arrive in 48 hours, was still 10 miles south of Arnhem. The American 82nd Airborne had finally captured Nijmegen Bridge on September 20th, but German resistance along Hell's Highway, the single narrow road connecting all the bridges, had repeatedly stopped the advance. Destroyed tanks blocked the route, German artillery interdicted key junctions, and the Guards Armoured Division, leading the advance, had fought continuously for 4 days and was approaching the limit of what even elite units could sustain. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, originally scheduled to drop on the 2nd day of the operation, had been delayed by weather and finally landed south of the Rhine on September 21st. They immediately came under fire from German forces that had crossed south from the now open Arnhem Bridge. 205 Poles eventually made it across the Rhine to reinforce the Oosterbeek perimeter, but the crossing was conducted under German illumination flares and heavy fire. It was too little, far too late. By September 24th, the tactical reality was undeniable. 1st Airborne Division was surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of everything. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. men. The division that had dropped with such confidence a week earlier was now fighting simply to survive long enough for evacuation. The decision to withdraw came on September 25th. 30 Corps had finally pushed close enough to establish a crossing point, and boats were brought forward under cover of darkness. The evacuation, designated Operation Berlin, would extract whatever remained of 1st Airborne across the Rhine to safety in Allied-controlled territory. It was conducted in darkness and rain. Men who had fought for 9 days were ordered to abandon their positions, leave their wounded who couldn't be moved, and infiltrate through German lines to evacuation points along the river. Some succeeded. Many did not. German forces, alerted to the withdrawal, poured fire into the evacuation routes and crossing points. By dawn on September 26th, approximately 2,100 men had made it across. From an original force of 10,000, the casualties were staggering. 1,500 killed, 2,200 wounded and captured, another 6,200 missing or taken prisoner. The 1st Airborne Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The Germans discovered the withdrawal around noon on the 26th, when they realized that British positions had fallen silent. They rounded up approximately 600 men, mostly wounded who couldn't be evacuated, and isolated pockets of resistance that had lost radio contact with division headquarters and didn't know about the withdrawal. Some British and Polish paratroopers managed to avoid capture, sheltered by the Dutch underground in houses, barns, and makeshift dens in the woods. They would remain hidden until Operation Pegasus extracted them on October 22nd. The strategic implications of the failure were immediate and profound. Operation Market Garden, the plan to end the war by Christmas, had collapsed completely. The Allied advance into Germany would be delayed for 6 months. The Rhine crossing, which Montgomery had hoped to achieve through airborne coup de main, would require massive conventional operations the following spring, and the war would grind on through another winter, another 100,000 casualties, another 6 months of death before Germany finally surrendered. But the tactical lessons were more nuanced. 1st Airborne Division had failed its mission. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The division itself was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Yet within that failure were elements that military historians would study for decades. Frost's 750 men at the bridge had held for 4 days against forces that should have overwhelmed them in hours. They had destroyed an entire German reconnaissance battalion. They had forced the SS to commit forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. They had tied down thousands of German troops who could have reinforced Nijmegen or attacked the American positions. And they had demonstrated that lightly armed airborne forces, properly led and professionally trained, could hold prepared positions against armour and artillery far longer than conventional doctrine suggested. The defence of Oosterbeek had been equally remarkable. 3,000 men holding a perimeter against 2 SS panzer divisions for 9 days, fighting without adequate ammunition, food, or water, maintaining discipline and organisation despite radio failures that would have shattered most units, conducting a controlled withdrawal under fire that saved 20% of the force when conventional wisdom said everyone should have been killed or captured. The German response had been professional and effective. The SS panzer divisions, despite being at reduced strength and in the area specifically to rest and refit, had mobilized within hours of the airborne landings. They had adapted their tactics to urban warfare. They had coordinated multiple Kampfgruppen to isolate and reduce British positions systematically. And they had achieved a defensive victory that became one of the war's few clear German successes after Normandy. The casualties told their own story. Approximately 1,500 British and Polish soldiers killed, 2,200 wounded, another 6,200 captured. German losses were harder to calculate precisely, but casualty rates in the Kampfgruppen fighting around Arnhem reached 50% in some units. The 9th SS Panzer Division alone suffered over 3,000 casualties. The urban combat had been exactly what military doctrine predicted: attritional, brutal, and costly for both sides, regardless of the eventual outcome. For Frost personally, the battle became the defining moment of a distinguished military career. He would be awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order, the citation noting his leadership in capturing and holding the bridge against overwhelming odds. But the recognition that mattered most came 33 years later, in 1977, when the Dutch government renamed the Arnhem Bridge itself the John Frost Bridge. It was an honour Frost initially resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of personal commemoration for a battle his division had lost, but his fellow officers convinced him to accept, recognising that the bridge's name honoured not just one man but all 750 paratroopers who had fought there. The memorial at the bridge's northern end reads simply, 17 to 21 September 1944. 2nd Parachute Battalion and other units of 1st Airborne Division held the north end of this bridge for 4 days. The broader question remained. Why had the plan failed? The answers were multiple and overlapping. Intelligence had failed to detect or properly assess the SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem. Planning had been rushed, with just 7 days between initial briefing and execution. The drop zones were too far from objectives, forcing a march through hostile territory. Radio equipment failed in exactly the conditions that should have been anticipated. Weather delayed reinforcements and resupply. The single narrow road to Arnhem created bottlenecks that German forces exploited ruthlessly. But beneath all the tactical and logistical failures was a strategic assumption that proved catastrophically wrong. Montgomery and his planners had assumed that German forces in Holland were demoralized, under strength, and incapable of effective resistance. They had assumed that lightning strikes by elite airborne forces could paralyze German response long enough for armor to arrive. They had assumed that one bold stroke could achieve what months of conventional operations could not. They were wrong. The Germans in Holland were veterans. They were under strength but professionally competent. They were capable of rapid tactical response and effective combined arms operations. And they understood that losing Arnhem meant losing all of Holland and opening the road to the Ruhr. They would fight for that bridge with everything they had. And so 750 British paratroopers, ordered to hold for 48 hours, held for 4 days. Not because the plan worked, not because relief was coming, but because professional soldiers, properly trained and effectively led, will hold impossible positions until physically incapable of continuing. Because courage and training can extend the limits of what's tactically feasible, far beyond what doctrine suggests. And because sometimes, the only thing between defeat and complete disaster is men who refuse to quit. The houses around Arnhem Bridge stood empty for years after the battle, too damaged for occupation, too symbolic to simply demolish. Dutch civilians would visit the ruins, leaving flowers at places where British paratroopers had died defending a country that wasn't their own. The bullet holes and shell damage remained visible in buildings that were eventually restored, physical evidence of fighting whose intensity is difficult to comprehend without having experienced urban combat personally. The airborne cemetery at Oosterbeek holds nearly 1,800 graves, 3/4 of them for men killed during the 9 days of fighting in September 1944. The cemetery sits on land permanently loaned to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission by the Dutch government, recognition that the battle mattered not just to Britain, but to the Netherlands itself. Annual memorial services are still held there every September, attended by veterans when they were alive, and by their families and Dutch citizens now that the last veterans are gone. The German dead from Arnhem were initially buried in the SS Heroes Cemetery near the city, but after the war they were reinterred at Ijsselstein, where over 30,000 German soldiers from the war are buried. The cemetery is maintained by the German War Graves Commission, funded by the German government, a permanent acknowledgement of the cost that war exacts from all participants regardless of which side they fought for. In military academies around the world, the Battle of Arnhem is studied as a case study in what happens when operational ambition exceeds tactical capability. The planning, failures, the intelligence lapses, the logistical inadequacies, the radio problems, the weather delays. Every mistake that could have been made was made, and the result was one of the war's most costly defeats for Allied airborne forces. But it's also studied for what went right: the courage of individual soldiers, the effectiveness of small unit leadership, the ability of professional forces to maintain cohesion under conditions that would have shattered less trained units. Frost's defence of the bridge, Urquhart's consolidation of the perimeter at Oosterbeek, the controlled withdrawal under fire that saved 2,000 men who should have been lost. The title, A bridge too far, coined by Lieutenant General Frederick Browning before the operation and popularized by Cornelius Ryan's book decades later, has become military shorthand for ambitious operations that extend beyond available resources. But the phrase obscures what actually happened at Arnhem. The bridge itself wasn't too far. 750 men reached it and held it against everything the Germans could field. The failure wasn't in reaching the objective, it was in the assumption that reaching it would be enough. Because modern warfare, especially in 1944, wasn't about bold strokes and lightning victories. It was about logistics, communications, combined arms coordination, and the ability to sustain operations over time. Paratroopers could seize ground, but holding it required artillery support, armor, resupply, reinforcement, and all the mundane factors that turn tactical success into strategic advantage. Market Garden failed because it tried to bypass those requirements through audacity and speed. The veterans who survived Arnhem carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Not as trauma, though that was present too, but as a defining experience that separated them from everyone who hadn't been there. They had fought at the bridge. They had held impossible positions. They had done everything professional soldiers could do and watched their mission fail anyway through factors beyond their control. In 1977, when the Arnhem Bridge was officially renamed the John Frost Bridge, the ceremony sought to acknowledge what had been overlooked in 1944. That courage matters. That professional competence matters. That men who hold impossible positions for 4 days against overwhelming odds have achieved something worthy of permanent recognition, even if the tactical mission failed. War correspondent Alan Wood wrote in 1944, "If in the years to come you meet a man who says, 'I was at Arnhem,' raise your hat and buy him a drink. It was the tribute of one professional to others. The recognition that some battles, regardless of outcome, mark the men who fought them as having faced something beyond normal human experience and survived. The bridge still stands. The John Frost Bridge, carrying traffic across the Rhine at Arnhem, rebuilt in the same style as the original but wider and stronger. 75 years after the battle, it remains one of the most important crossings in the Netherlands. Thousands of vehicles cross it daily, most drivers unaware of what happened there in September 1944. But the memorial at the northern end remains, a simple plaque with names and dates. And every September, when Dutch citizens and visiting veterans gather there, they remember that 750 men held this ground for 4 days, that they fought with impossible courage against impossible odds, and that they turned a tactical defeat into something that military historians still study as an example of what properly trained soldiers can achieve when everything else has failed. Because in the end, that's what Arnhem was. Not a bridge too far, not a failed operation, not a costly mistake, but a demonstration that courage, training, and leadership can push the boundaries of what's tactically possible far beyond what doctrine suggests. That men will hold when holding seems impossible. That professional soldiers will fight to the last round, the last position, the last moment of consciousness, not because they expect to win, but because that's what professional soldiers do. The Germans who fought at Arnhem understood it. The SS officers who offered truces to evacuate wounded, who provided medical care to prisoners, who greeted captured paratroopers with respect rather than contempt. They recognized what they had faced. Not broken troops or demoralized conscripts, but elite soldiers who had held longer than anyone had a right to expect. And when the shooting finally stopped, when the last British positions fell silent, and the Germans cautiously approached to take prisoners, they found men who had fought for 4 days without adequate ammunition, food, water, or medical supplies. Men who were still organized, still disciplined, still capable of fighting if they'd had anything left to fight with. It was a tribute to training, leadership, and the human capacity to endure far beyond the point where endurance seems possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.